My main man, Russ, is probably one of the strongest advocates for everything that I just said.
All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Matz, and I am your host. This episode is about BYU again and critical race theory. Early on in this series, I think in the first video, in fact, I did, a first or second, on BYU, my biggest concern was that with the words of President Nelson and President Oaks about rooting out racism, which is crucial, right? That's an active position that we need to take, that it would be conflated with CRT, with critical race theory, and that professors especially, and students as well, would take the words of President Nelson and President Oaks and say, okay, CRT here is exactly what we need to do in order to fulfill the words of the prophets, right? Hugely concerning. I stated this before, but a hierarchical structure in the church is very important in terms of protecting the church from pernicious ideologies. And what I mean by that is if you look at the Southern Baptist Convention and even the Church of England to a lesser extent, you see a lot of issues there of things breaking apart, people leaving the Southern Baptist Convention, people threatening to leave the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the country, in the United States. And it's all over CRT. It's all over this idea of critical social justice and how it's playing out in religion. Well, in our religion, with the Latter-day Saints, the strong hierarchical structure and culture that we have as members of the church is a real fortress to protect us against a lot of these pernicious ideologies. Here's the problem, though. The biggest weakness of that hierarchical structure is if you can attach an ideology like critical theory, specifically critical race theory, to that hierarchical structure, right? Follow the prophet, and put those together, conflate them into the same message, then you've got a real problem. And if that voice wins out, even if it's a short-term voice, a year or 2 or 5 or whatever it is, you're going to have an immense amount of influence, especially on younger adults and kids, on being able to bring in the ideology of critical race theory. Because after all, antiracism and critical race theory, pretty much the same thing, very close, are the words of the prophets. This is what President Nelson is talking about. This is what President Oaks is talking about. So that was my biggest concern. And sure enough, as I started getting messages from students and faculty and aides and professors there at BYU, this is what has started to come up more and more, especially in the last couple of months. I have been studying this stuff for about 8 years, especially starting even more so in about 2015, especially after reading Jonathan Haidt's book that goes over a lot of the world of the universities and what was happening there. And before all of this stuff especially about schools and elementary schools and high schools and the big fight between the Republicans and the parents in these school boards, that's a very recent thing. This thing has been going on forever, especially in the universities. But earlier this year, as I started getting some of these messages, I just decided, look, I've got to talk about it. I've got to bring this stuff up. Because this was my concern. When President Nelson got up and told us that we needed to root out racism, that is, whatever you think of that, is it hey, I'm not a racist, or you're not a racist, or whatever you think of that, the point is that the prophet that sees that there's a problem. He can see throughout the church and sees the problems that rise up from the wars through the stakes. He sees some issues here. And he's asking us to root them out. So we need to do that. But when he's got that message out there, and then you have the pervasiveness of critical race theory a Marxist-based ideology. Don't let anybody tell you any different. It's exactly what the roots are. Exactly what the roots are in the words of the critical race theorists. Okay, we'll go over a little bit of that here with Ibram Kendi. But when I heard that and saw what was going on at BYU, this became my biggest concern, is that you would have people in positions of authority in the university, professors primarily, teachers and administration, that are going to start pushing this through, especially with the new department, which looks like it's going to come to fruition here shortly, of diversity. I want to say it right because it's a little different. I think it's diversity, inclusion, or diversity, equity, and belonging, right? It's usually diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. This is the same thing. You can say a different word, whatever. It's going to be the same thing. But here's the problem. What you heard here at the beginning was a professor in healthcare. Healthcare. This is not going through social studies or anything else, right? This is healthcare. And what he is going to say here, and I'm not going to bring up his name, and I'm not going to show his picture. I'm not going to show his class or anything like that. But what he's going to bring up here is exactly the most dangerous thing possible that you can imagine. And the reason I bring this up is the most important thing for you is to know what is being taught, how this message is going to be twisted from the prophets. It's very easy to do. And when you are in a bubble of academia, you hear over and over again preaching to the choir that CRT, anti-racism, is a positive thing. It is not. It is not. And it has nothing in the end. It has nothing to do with race. Critical race theory has, at the very core of it, nothing to do with race. I know that's a bold statement. Anti-racism, in the end, the very, very core of this, the chassis of this, it has nothing to do with racism. It's ideology. That is what is being brought in through race. Now, this professor specifically makes reference to Ibram Kendi. And I want to go over a little bit who Ibram Kendi is, because the professor says, just like my man Russ, right? Russell Nelson, the president, the prophet of the church, he and Ibram Kendi are saying the same thing. This is not just at BYU, by the way. This is in our wards. I get messages consistently that this is being taught in your Sunday school. This is being taught in Elders Quorum and Relief Society. It's being taught in youth classes. Not like it's fully pervasive or anything like that, but it's coming, right? BYU is the first place we're really going to get this because it's in academia. But I am getting these stories. They are starting to be taught. Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo's names, and the idea of white privilege and of anti-racism are coming up in our wards. So you need to get an understanding of who the people are that are peddling this. Because most of the people that repeat it, that regurgitate it, they don't really know what they're talking about. They think it is something that is right. And if they just a little bit even conflate what the prophet is saying with these other individuals that have this very concerning ideology, because it can do so much damage so fast, we need to be ready for it. But what I want to do here is I want to go a little bit to this professor and what he has to say. And then I'm going to give more and more information about who Ibram Kendi is, okay? The professor loves Ibram Kendi. Just finished reading his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Anti-racist, when you really dig down into what it is, it means an activist. And it's not just about race, okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at this a little bit. Listen to what he has to say.
So it's important. You'll hear me talk about race and racism here for a little bit. It's important that we have a common definition of racist and what racist is. Okay. So a racist is someone who supports racist policy. Okay. racist policy through what they do or decide not to do, or when they're expressing or advocating for a racist idea. That's what a...
Okay, so let's be very clear here. This is one of the things that's happening that is also concerning. They're very good wordsmiths. They're very, very good at this. Ibram Kendi is especially very good at this. When you study the way he uses words and titles and phrases and new concepts like anti-racism. This is Ibram Kendi's definition of racism. This is not your definition of racism. So what he is doing, he's taking a new definition, his own, Ibram Kendi, of racism and what it is, and making it, instead of what you think it is, of thinking that someone is superior because of their race over somebody else, right? Or using that in a very pernicious way. That's not Ibram Kendi's definition. So his definition is that if you are a racist, you are not just somebody like that, but you are also a racist if you're not doing anything about it. How often? All the time. Every single time there is a chance for you to see racism, like Robin DiAngelo says. It's not whether or not racism occurs. It's how much of it do you see in every example. Where does it manifest itself in this transaction here between people? Verbally, whatever happens. That's the idea of anti-racism. It means that you must be an activist all of the time to not be a racist. So look what the professor's doing here. He's taking on he's telling all these students, this is what racism is. Ibram Kendi's definition of racism is racism. This is in his healthcare class. That's the first thing to take a look at. Let's continue here.
I recently read this really awesome book by Ibram Kendi on how to be an anti-racist. It's important enough to me that we're going to talk about it briefly here in class, but I would recommend that you actually read the actual book. It's a very...
Yeah, I've read the book. I've gone through the workbook that goes along with it. Very concerning. It doesn't mean 100% of it's bad. Nothing is ever 100% bad, right? Nothing is ever 100% bad. But the overall arching message on this, and please go read it. I recommend that you read it. Is that the chassis that all these critical race theories run on is Marxism, and again, there's just no way to deny it because they say it over and over and over again that this is what they're running with. They are fighting liberal democracy, and they want to put something else in place. Okay, so this is what Ibram Kendi is all about. He wants to get rid of meritocracy. He wants to get rid of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps if you have an opportunity to do that. He doesn't care about opportunity. Okay, he cares about equity, which is, in the end, a forced sameness, an outcome for everybody.
But the book makes advocates. This is a book that's advocating for anti-racism. Okay?
Anti-racism.
And the first step that you can do is to stop saying, "Oh, I'm not racist," right? In fact, if you want to spot a racist, that's the first thing they'll do is they say, "Oh, I'm not racist."
Okay, let's stop right there. Your kid's in his class, and they hear this. I mean, by the way, this guy's a member of the church. He's at BYU, and he's saying to these kids, these students in the class, if you say to yourself you're not a racist, that's a good way for you to see that you are a racist. That is Ibram Kendi's definition. This is how Ibram Kendi appropriates the term and the concept of racism.
So here's what you can do.
This is becoming an activist here.
Racial inequity, right? We're not talking about inequality. We're talking about inequity. There's a difference. We can talk about that at some point.
I would love for him to be able to talk about this at some point. That would really be would be great, right? Is if he actually did talk about the difference between inequality, which is more opportunity, and equity, which is forced outcome. as President Oakes talks about, then he would not be able to, without twisting his tongue, he would not be able to complete what he's about to go over here. Because one of them is opportunity given to you for everybody to work hard and to get ahead. The other one is we are going to force, and that can get ugly, right? Or it can be by law, which could be ugly too. We're going to force the outcome. That's the difference between inequality and inequity. So he skips right through that. My guess is he doesn't really understand the difference.
But all of the disparities in all of these things are symptoms of racial inequities and disparities. Identify those sorts of things.
Okay. So again, this is soft talk that he's doing here. This is a soft position on what Ibram Kendi really talks about, which is being an activist. And that's part of this chassis and of this critical social justice, this critical theory. You can't do it without being an activist. If you look at the curriculum that goes into the schools, and I'm talking about your kids or grandkids of K through 12, one of the three things that I've identified in looking at thousands of pages of curriculum on this is one of those three things is activism. One of the three major things they want to do is take the kids, regardless of what their parents have to say, by the way, and activate them. So that's what anti-racism ultimately is. He doesn't always talk about that, being Ibram Kendi. He doesn't always talk about everything else. But that in the end, right, from what I've studied, in my estimation, and he's a part of everything else, you'll see that here, this is all part of the same chassis. Right? They want a new system. They want, and I mean a completely new system that is going to be put into place here. All right, a little bit further here on this screen with the professor here.
Examining your ideas, your views. Examine the causes that you support. Examine the statements that you make or the memes that you share on social media. Right?
Okay, some of these things are good, right?
And
there's some good here.
Look,
there's some things that you need to look
justified.
At. It's important.
See if you are justifying racial inequality in your views, in your beliefs, in the memes that you share.
Right. So the justified racial inequality is not just a matter of inequality, right? It's not inequality. The real answer here is justified racial equity. That's key in understanding this. They are bringing in through race a completely different system of government and thought. That sounds radical because these people are radical. They're all radical. This is the same exact movement that came around in the 60s. You had Martin Luther King with a civil rights movement on one end, which was I have a dream. And that is that that my children and your children, right, will not be judging each other by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. These critical race theorists, they all fight against that. They don't want that. None of them do. Now, Ibram Kendi's a little bit lighter on a couple things. He doesn't believe in segregation. A lot of the critical race theorists want segregation. Okay. And so he's kind of a little lighter on things. But again, you're going to see some things here that are going to be very odd. And what we're about to see here is Kendi being used as an example of President Nelson's words.
Right? Because that's something that you can fix. And that's something that Jesus says, hey, everybody down there, can you please fix this? Okay.
So in other words, Jesus agrees with Ibram Kendi, is what he's saying. This is at BYU, right? He's using a highly charged political figure, the professor is, like Ibram Kendi, and comparing him to Jesus on what needs to be done with race. That I just, and if you think this is the only place this is happening at BYU, it's not even close. Not from the stories that I've got. Another thing I want to point out here is, again, we're not just talking about better race relations, right? Or rooting out racism here. We're taking on an ideology with Ibram Kendi. He's completely talking about your anti-racism. That is an ideology and a manner of being. It is not just, I'm going to have better race relations with people. I'm going to help with that. It is a way of being. Now, he's also going to bring up here intersectionality. This is from Kimberly Crenshaw, someone Ibram Kendi refers to quite a bit.
Right. So here's just understand how your anti-racism is just necessarily intersexual, right? So if there's an issue, if there's a policy, right, that creates some kind of inequality between, white people and Native Americans, then at the same time, it's also yielding some kind of inequality between white males and Native American women.
Okay, that's intersectionality from Kimberly Crenshaw, who was the first person to coin critical race theory as a term, okay, in the 80s. So this is intersectionality. This is critical race theory. This is critical theory in a broader view. That's exactly what he is teaching here. And if you go look back at Kimberly Crenshaw and what she teaches, right, it is not part of the gospel. This is the exact opposite. Intersectionality is to segregate everybody out into collectives, into groups. And then which ones of these groups do you participate in? And where on the totem pole of grievances do you sit based on the number of groups that you participate in? Right? If you are a part of 2 oppressed groups, then you're up pretty high. If you're 3, you're up even higher. And this is how data is being used today, this type of intersectionality, to decide policy. And we're going to see this more and more and more as it manifests throughout all of our institutions. Look what he says here at the bottom. This is what he's saying here is be an anti-racist like Ibram Kendi. Adopt anti-racism. Adopt critical race theory is what he is saying here.
And then lastly, get on board.
Yeah.
Champion anti-racist ideas. Champion policies.
Okay, so this is activism. See, this is where it will always lead to. This is what you will see. If you do not follow the most politicized idea of what these individuals push, again, the chassis that's carrying them, then you're not being enough of an anti-racist. Champion, he says. He's telling these students, champion anti-racist ideas and policies. This is political. Vote for certain policies. Vote for the right politicians that are going to put these policies into place. Okay, now let's go a little bit further here, and this is where it really gets concerning.
Champion solutions to problems that get around the policies that reverse the policies that led to these racial inequities and disparities in the first place. Okay, get on board with that kind of stuff. And you can take my word for it, or you can listen to my main man Russ here.
Wow. He's taking political activism. Don't think of this it's not just saying, I want to make something better for everybody. That is such a lie. It's such a lie. It is be an activist, a political activist. And this is what Russell M. Nelson is telling us to do, right? This is what he has to say about it.
My main man, Russ, is probably one of the strongest advocates for everything that I just said.
What? The prophet is one of the strongest advocates for anti-racism and activism. The prophet is someone who is going to push critical race theory. That's what he just said.
Right. And so please, here are some steps that President Nelson says that we should be doing right now. We should be praying.
Okay, so a few things that I want to say about this. first of all, these are the 4 steps, right? Pray that we will all abandon attitudes of prejudice. That's a great thing. That has nothing to do with what Ibram Kendi says. It's the exact opposite. Look for ways to reach out and serve someone of a different background or race. That sounds great and wonderful. That is not Ibram Kendi's message. Sorry. Teach children in the home to love all and to find the good in others. That is absolutely the opposite of what Ibram Kendi teaches and the critical race theorists. 4, learn to value the differences in others. Wonderful, right? Wonderful. That is not what Ibram Kendi teaches. And yet this is exactly what he's saying. He is conflating the two. It is very, very concerning. A little bit more from him.
To abandon all the attitudes that we have of prejudice, right? Think about what Ibram Kendi just told us to do, right? No difference. We should be looking for ways to reach out and to serve, right? President Nelson is not telling us, hey, man, be colorblind. Like, ooh, we don't see color. That is not what President Nelson.
Okay, what he is doing here is, this professor here, is he is taking buzzwords and their concepts. He knows enough about this. He doesn't seem to know a lot, but he knows enough about this with certain words to use them the way that Ibram Kendi does and that critical race theorists do. So color blindness is what Martin Luther King asked for. He just had talked about how great Martin Luther King was. Well, that's not what Martin Luther King asked for, not the color of their skin, but for the content of their character. Critical race theory says the exact opposite. We must see race in everything all the time. Okay, and you'll see the term color blindness always be as a pejorative, as something that needs to be tossed to the side from Ibram Kendi and all of the critical race theorists.
Yeah, and this was such a big deal that last summer, my main man Russ, he's like, yo, it's a big deal. Like, get on board with this, please.
Get on board with Ibram
all
Kendi.
Of us. The creator is asking us to do this now, right?
Look at how this is being conflated.
Get on board, right? Or get out of the way.
Get on board or get out of the way. You can see he is completely converted.
Such a big deal.
He's completely
that just a
converted
short time
to
later,
this.
3 months later, Elder Dallin Oaks gave a speech on racism, like just calling it out.
I am just. This is exactly what you could see would be happening. That this would happen. There's no way around it. It's not just going to happen at BYU. It is going to happen at our wards. It's going to happen in our elders' quorums, and it's going to happen in our this whole idea here. The more that this gets pulled together, even without the words of President Nelson and Elder Oaks or President Oaks, it's still going to happen. But with that, and the idea like this professor has of conflating critical race theory and the words of the prophets, it's going to happen very fast. You're going to start seeing it in your lessons coming up here. You need to fight against it. You need to fight against it. You need to be able to parse out the idea of what the prophets are saying and what these critical race theorists say. If you think back to the revolution of the October 1917, the 1917 October Revolution in Russia, right? Think of it this way. There were a lot of poor people. There was a very incompetent czar that was ruling in Russia, and there was a lot of disruption, and actually the Leninists were not a very big group to start with. But because of the openings that came about because of this czar and other issues that were happening here, they gained more and more power. And think of it this way. What did communism claim it was going to do? It was going to help out the poor and fight against the aristocracy of the czar, right? It's going to lift up the poor out of poverty. And so think of it like this. With critical race theory, all you're doing is replacing, not all, but mostly, this is the clear idea here, you are replacing economic class with race. That's what's happening. It's the same exact ideology underneath both of those. It's the same chassis. The model of car is a little bit different. The color of the car is a little bit different. Maybe one's a convertible, one's a van, right? But it's the same chassis that is trying to move us from one spot to the same other spot. It's the exact same thing. So if someone said to you just before October 1917 in Russia, do you believe in communism? And you said no, their response might be, so you don't care for the poor, right? What this group of people, these radicals, have done that is very effective is they have made it, just like this professor is bought in, hook, line, and sinker, into get on board, right? Champion this. What they have done is they have conflated the idea of creating better race relations and creating better outcomes for people with critical race theory and anti-racism, as if that's the only way to do it. No, it's a horrific way to do it. We look back at 1917 and what that brought about with the Soviet Union. What happened with Lenin, unbelievable brutality, with the gulags, with everybody being forced into equity is what it was. And then the horrors of Stalin coming later on. And of course, the lack of liberty, the lack of a liberal democracy that you get more in an economic sense through capitalism. These critical theorists are all against that. Some come out directly to say it all the time, but they all say it at one point or another. They are fighting liberal democracy. They don't like it. They will put other words sometimes in place, meritocracy, capitalism. But they are fighting liberal Western democracy. That is what they are trying to change. When we talk about systemic racism, the reason they do that, because you can't ever separate the system from the people. You don't go out and say, oh, well, the racism is just in the systems. It's in the institutions. No one's saying that people are the racist ones. The policies and the systems are racist. No, you can't separate those. And of course, how does it manifest itself? You can see it in schools and everywhere else. And the whole idea of white fragility does not have to do with just the system that's racist. It's you're racist. So the reason they want systemic racism as the issue is because they want to change the system. Not a little bit, but a complete revolution in changing what the system is. It's liberal democracy. Let's go back to Ibram Kendi here just a little bit and talk about him, what this professor is conflating with the words of President Nelson and President Oaks. I'm sure they'd be very happy about this, right? Let's talk just a little bit about Ibram Kendi. I've been criticized for not bringing up certain things and writings and statements from some of the critical race theorists in the past. I'm getting to that. I'll have a complete episode on that shortly. But let's bring up a little bit about Ibram Kendi here. In his book, Stamped from the Beginning, this is a book that I've read and studied very closely. He has 5 different sections in this. He puts they're each on 5 individuals. The last individual that he mentions and supports, holding her up as a model, is Angela Davis. Angela Davis was a member of the Black Panther Party. Remember, that was in the 60s. That's the completing, 60s, 70s. That's the competing fight against civil rights. You had Martin Luther King, and then over here, early on, Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party, Marcusa, and all of this staged protests from the colleges, universities. That was the 2 different competing sides. There was Martin Luther King, and then there were the radicals. The critical race theorists are the radicals, the exact same people, and the next generation of them that pull from the same exact things. So Angela Davis, who's being held up as a model here by Ibram Kendi, was a member of the Black Panther Party. She was an outright communist. Not my words. Her words over and over and over again. She accepted the Communist Party USA's nomination for vice president. She's a communist even today. And Ibram Kendi is holding her up as the model. She's the last one in here to be held up as the model, the recent model of who we should be following. In that book, he also fights against those within his own community, within the black community, who say that we need a 2-parent nuclear family. He talks about how horrible that is. He even calls it racist. His term for that is assimilationist, someone that moves into a white, what he would call a white type of an ideal, as a two-parent family with their kids. Here, another example of that is fighting against the civil rights lawyer Eleanor Holmes Norton, right? When in 1985, she urged the restoration of the traditional black family. He berates this, as do all critical race theorists. They do not want the nuclear family. This is why with Black Lives Matter, and I'm talking about the organization, until last year, they had on their website that they were one of their objectives was to get rid of, to destroy, to dismantle the nuclear family, because this is what Marx and Engels said. This is what you had to do to change the system, especially Engels. Now, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, the one that's very popular today, he talks about his parents who were inspired, I quote, by Malcolm X and Angela Davis. Right? These are who his parents, we could add in there Cone, the religious leaders of Cone and Skinner, who were the fathers, so to speak, of liberation theology, which is a Marxist type of Christianity. And then he gets even more precise here about liberal democracy and who he really is. He talks about Du Bois, right, who was an early 20th century black leader and thought leader who really had immersed himself into Marxist thought and readings, but never really joined on board because he didn't feel that Marxism allowed for the black community to be a part of it. He didn't see that there was support for the black community. But here's what he says about him. He says, an anti-racist anti-capitalism could seal the horizontal class fissures and vertical race fissures, and importantly, their intersections with equalizing racial and economic policies. So this is where he wants to get rid of liberal democracy. He purposefully uses these types of words: an anti-racist, which is already getting support, anti-capitalism. Right? So it's one and the same thing to him. Not what I'm inferring, right? This is what he says. It's the same thing. Racism is capitalism. Racism is liberal democracy. Those are his words. And he talks about how these groups are resurfacing again, these anti-capitalists, these Marxist-type groups. He says they are winning elections, rushing into anti-capitalist organizations and exposing the myths of capitalism. When he says capitalism, he's using it in the way that it used to be used by the communists, right? It's capitalism, it's fascists, but really what we're talking about is Western liberal democracy. In talking about this liberation theology, I bring this up a lot because I think it is absolutely crucial to understand, because it's the way I believe, in my estimation, the way that Christianity is going to take the biggest hit. It's going to come from liberation theology and the anti-racist critical race theory movement. He says that in 1970, black power had enraptured my parents, right? This is the radical Marcuse, Angela Davis type of, back then they just came out and said that they were communists, not just Marxists. They stopped thinking about saving black people in their Christian faith and started thinking about liberating black people. I've had a number of people say, oh, that's not what Kendi means, right? When he talks about a savior theology versus a liberation theology, he doesn't mean that. He means exactly that. They stopped saving people, in other words, from your sins and from an afterlife. He doesn't care about the spirit. He says that over and over again. It's about the body. What that means is now. And what you're doing is liberating the body. So he makes that distinction of savior theology and the spirit being pushed away, and savior and liberation theology in the body being what is most important. His dad asks Cone, what is your definition of a Christian? And Cone looked at Dad, he says, with equal seriousness and responded, a Christian is one who is striving for liberation. Okay, that is Ibram Kendi. That's who he is. The antithesis of President Nelson and President Oaks. Now, lastly, I want to go over a few different audio clips of Kendi. This is in 2019, I believe. He's in San Francisco. And who is he with? He's with Angela Davis, the communist, the radical from the 60s and the 70s. She's a revolutionary. And so is Ibram Kendi. Listen to what Ibram Kendi has to say about Angela Davis here to start off.
Could truly serve as a model for anti-racist thought. I couldn't see anyone better than Angela Davis. And I think...
Again, this is in his own words. It's not my words. I'm not trying to put him into a box here to try and create outrage. That is not the point here. I've held off on this for years. That's not what he's doing. He is Angela Davis. He just gives us different, prettier words. Now, coming back to the system of liberal democracy, this is what he says on our current system of government.
And so I think you have to fundamentally believe in the possibility of basically smashing this system. I mean, you have to believe that in order to truly be an activist.
Okay, in order to truly be an activist. And again, you see what his anti-racism really is. It's about becoming an activist, a radical activist, if you read the literature on this. Now, you're going to hear a student here, a young student who is in attendance, but she's going to ask a question for a very good reason. And that is that all of these things go together. She knows what the answer is. She pretty much already knows what Ibram Kendi is going to say. Let's listen to this.
The question is largely, how do you see the root of racism and sexism as coming from capitalism?
Okay, so this is what Ibram Kendi's book says, and what all of the critical race theorists are going to say. Capitalism, liberal democracy, are the root of racism and sexism and homophobia, all of these things. So when we hear about the intersectionality and all of these, your sexual orientation and your also your financial class, your economic class is thrown in there as well, and your race, all of these things are being thrown in there together because intersectionality, those that are in that totem pole, they are that way and they are oppressed, we are told by the critical race theorists, including Ibram Kendi, because of liberal democracy. Again, down below all of this, it's not about race. It's just not. It is the new vehicle to move from one point to another, because it wasn't going to work otherwise. This is exactly what Gramsci says. This is what Marcuse says, and all of his friends. Now, lastly here, when I talk about the fact that these are radicals, and I hope you're getting more and more of a sense of this, I am getting to this episode that's going to bring all of their own words into all of these things. But understand they mean exactly that. They're not holding back. This is not something, you have those that are the movers and shakers, the authors of this, the peddlers of this. And then you have others beyond that are people in academia, or although most of them know what's going on, but some in academia. And then you have like the media, right? And those that are in the kind of that middle ground between those pushing it and authoring it and organizing it and you, in between those two, the media is a good example. There are people that take out all of the ugly stuff. They take out all the ugly stuff, and they talk about the carrot. They talk about race relations and pulling on your heartstrings a little bit and the good things that you would want to do. But what they don't talk about is the fact that this is all about a specific agenda to get something done, and that this is the solution to them. So remember that. You always need to go back to what is the agenda, what is being pushed, and go back to their own words. I want to end on these words with Ibram Kendi. Understand that Ibram Kendi wants a revolution. It may not be a violent one that he would prefer, but he wants a revolution. He wants a change. All of these critical race theorists do not want a little bit of policy change. They put in systematic racism because they want to change the system completely. They want revolution. These are the same words that were offered in the 60s and the 70s from the same people and the same ideology. As a student asks Ibram Kendi, what can we do? Are we, when we get pushed back a little bit on our agenda, what can we do? Can it happen? This is what Ibram Kendi says.
You talk about the Cuban Revolution, when they arrived on the beaches, and I think there was Castro had about 250 people with him, and immediately they were wiped out, or half of them were wiped out. And so then they had 125 that ran up into the mountains. And essentially they were going to wage a revolution against a 10,000-man standing army that was backed by the most vicious military power this world has ever known in the U.S. Army.
The most vicious power the world has ever known in the U.S. military. Who is the hero here? And who is the enemy to Ibram Kendi? This is what Ibram Kendi is about. This is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is not President Nelson. This has nothing to do with his words. This is not President Oaks. This has nothing to do with his words. Thanks for listening.